Hello, and welcome to the Catholic Passage Podcast. My name is Aaron Lorch, and I'm today's host. This podcast aims to pursue the truth, an authentic Catholic life, a deep integration of faith and reason, and a joyful community of families, raising the next generation of the Catholic faithful. Today's guest is Zachary Wiese, who is the Communications Manager at Catholic Rural Life, a Catholic nonprofit organization promoting Catholic life in rural America. I'm really excited to share our conversation through this episode, where Zach and I discuss the history and background of Catholic rural life, their digital and in-person offerings for both clergy and laity, the unique intersection of our faith and rural life, and, of course, so much more. We hope you enjoy our conversation and that it might bless you in some way. All right, here we go. Zachary Wiese, thanks for coming on the Catholic Passage Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And so for all our listeners, can we just kind of start off here? I know you as the communications manager of Catholic Rural Life, right? What is that? First off, what is Catholic Rural Life? And as a communications manager, what are you in charge of?
Yeah, so Catholic Rural Life is a 100-plus year Catholic apostolate started in 1923 by Archbishop Edwin V. O'Hara, who actually studied at the St. Paul Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is kind of close to where we are headquartered at the moment. And, during that time, there was a thought of neglect for education in rural areas. They kind of noticed a poor catechesis, a lack of Catholic schools and Catholic educations in rural areas. So Archbishop O'Hara recognized this issue and started using Catholic Rural Life to produce vacation schools. It was majority in the western part of the United States, going down to the southern part, and focused on, education. And so throughout the years, we've taken many different forms, bringing in thoughts of integral ecology. There was one point that we had Pope John Paul II speak at a Rural Life Mass in Iowa. And so it's all ebb and flow, and we're kind of ever changing and figuring out, how to best support Catholics in rural areas. And my job as communications manager is trying to, build up this awareness of Catholic life, especially in rural areas, and make sure, we can be a resource for catechesis, for evangelization strategies for those in rural. And we do that via, social media, as well as a quarterly magazine, which has been going on for a very long time. I don't know the exact amount of years. There was a little sabbatical, I believe, in the 80s with it, but there's a quarterly magazine, and I'm in charge of managing that process and making sure the topics are relevant for those living in rural. And so I just really focus on, building up the awareness of Catholic rural life currently and making sure we reach those who need to be reached and who need that support in their lives in rural. Many people can attest to there's a lot of isolation, and so we have to kind of figure out the best way to reach those people.
Sure. Now, that newsletter, before I backtrack a little bit, is that being sent out to just anybody that signs up, or is that a paid thing? Are you part of a membership? I'm trying to kind of feed you something here.
Yeah, definitely. So we are a membership-based organization. The lowest tier that we have is $25 a year, and that gets you access to the online version of the magazine, which is just a PDF version that you can go onto our website, onto the portal, so you get login access and can do it that way. A lot of people opt in for the $50 a year option, which will give you a printed version of that magazine. And in there, contains kind of the news items of what we've been up to for the past quarter, as well as stories, like I said, that are topical, around 8 stories that are topical. And we get theologians that are talking about integral ecology, talking about care of creation, dignity of work. But we also have real-time stories of whether from our members or from other people in rural communities who are actively working the land and getting kind of an insight of their life, so that our other readers can kind of see other people who are doing similar things that they're doing and kind of have that connection.
Oh, absolutely. It's like you're sharing, people can have that relatability from seeing real people, whether they're lay people or clergy, like you said. Now, it almost sounds like you guys have quite a bit of digital content out there, but also, similar to Catholic Passage, really, you also have a lot of in-person stuff. And so people might be finding out about that in these newsletters, keeping up to date. But let's say you're someone that's nearby. Like what's something that
me as a layperson, if I was nearby, what could I do coming to say an event? What would be an example?
Yep. So for both like online and in-person events, I mean, we're constantly working to improve and increasing the quantity of which we're doing those type of events. Currently, the best way that Lady gets involved on the ground and in person is through our chapter system. So we have 35 chapters in 30 dioceses, totaling 29 states at the moment. And so these are all
Wow, that's a lot.
these are all diocesan approved. So we get bishop approval to be operating within these dioceses and get their support. A lot of the times, the bishop will celebrate their yearly real life mass if they're only having one. Sometimes we have some dioceses that do two. They do one for planting season, they do one for harvest season, and so those will pop up in a lot in the Midwest area. In what I've noticed, in a lot of statistics, kind of say there's a lot more, not only just agriculture, but Catholic population, Catholic farmers specifically within the Midwest region. So, your Iowa, your Nebraska, your Wisconsin, Minnesota, Dakotas area. But we do have a lot of chapters down in Texas area too. So like I know Diocese of Victoria hosts 2 real life masses a year. And so just attending those and showing support that way. And as I kind of mentioned, we're working on bringing about more valuable in-person events as well, more personal and type of events, bringing integral ecology and being able to speak to laity to understand kind of what the church already has as teaching when working the land, but also maybe more of the nuanced stuff that hasn't really been discussed when we're talking about kind of modern aged technology, GMOs, the automatic milking stuff. You're mixing in dignity of work. Farmers are getting more technologically advanced, having to fire workers. And we have people asking us all the time, like, what does the church teach on this? And a lot of the time, there is no teaching on it. You have to use your best judgment and kind of read what's on your heart and use your, faculties of reason to be able to figure out how do you stay in business? How do you keep feeding the world? Because if you go to business, that hurts the food supplies, in some instances. And so you got to make these decisions for yourself. But we want to kind of keep that conversation going and keep sparking that conversation across America, especially so people can make those informed decisions for soil health and animal treatment, et cetera. The list goes on and on.
Yeah, exactly. The catechism is a huge manuscript document, but there's a lot missing from it. We can't look at it and be like, okay, this is going to tell me exactly what to do. And you have to kind of fill in the blanks somewhat. And obviously there's prayer and discernment and spiritual guidance that can be had by reaching out to the right people as well. You were saying across the U.S., across the Midwest, jumping back to that, why do you think that you guys don't have more of a presence out in the far West where, like, say, California has a lot of, and Utah, I mean, I know there's a lot of agriculture out there, or even on the East and the Southeast, et cetera. Montana, there's ranchers. You mentioned Texas, but I guess to my question, how come there isn't more of a presence?
I think it's probably leaning more to the awareness thing. Like I said, we've been around for 100 years. And there's been times where Catholic rural life has been extremely popular and other times where, it kind of less than so based on many different factors. So I'd say awareness in those areas. And we're trying to get in those regions, through one of our programs, the Rural Areas and Small Towns Initiative. We do have a partnership with the Diocese of Stockton over there in the northern part of California, specifically to address, those farmers who are out there, the vineyards, the tomato farmers, dairy farmers, what have you.
Yeah.
And really trying to spread that reach. Another thing that I think in my time at Catholic Rural Life, and this is more anecdotal evidence, is when I thought of agriculture before, to me, it was all cows, corn, and soybeans, because what was grown here a lot in Minnesota, a lot in Wisconsin areas. And that spreads out pretty far Midwestern, a lot of corn farms, even down in Kansas, down in Nebraska. So it's very similar. And so I think one thing that has been helping lately is to talk about agriculture as more than just kind of those Midwest staples. Talk about the tomato farmers, talk about the peach farmers, orange farmers, talk to those who are ranching specifically. Because, kind of as you mentioned, people can see themselves in some of the stories that we tell and they kind of feel that connection to Catholic rural life and get involved in that way. And so I think for a while we were probably talking about agriculture in a certain way, our understanding, because before it was headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota, we were headquartered in Des Moines, Iowa. So still Midwest. And so we can see what's around us. And that's our perception a little bit of agriculture. But being able to branch out and learn the way of life, it changes all across the United States. And so to be able to understand that, I think that helps people connect with us better, helps them trust us, a little bit more. When we talk about, things like integral ecology or rural evangelization techniques, that it actually sounds like we've been to one of their communities before.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Actually, on that note with the Des Moines thing, do you know the history on why did it switch from Des Moines? I mean, I'm an Iowan, so maybe I'm biased, but I just think when I go to Des Moines, I don't have to go very far outside of town or city, really, where there's cornfields. And then there's suburbs, if you will, of Des Moines that are very much more agricultural. When I think of the Twin Cities, sorry, but my bias is I don't think of agriculture so much. I don't really think Midwestern. A lot of people that live there don't know what a corn plant is. They don't know what a cow. They probably think that chocolate milk comes from a brown cow, maybe. So,
yes.
Why did it move to St. Paul?
So, from my knowledge, it moved in 2008 when we got our new executive director, who's still currently working at Catholic Rural Life. He's still the executive director, and he's doing a great job. And his reasoning, it was because we formed a partnership with the St. Paul Seminary, and we kind of switched how, as I said, ebb and flow of what we're focusing on, and switch to more of pastoral leadership. And so in partnering with the St. Paul Seminary there, Dr. Christopher Thompson has kind of been spearheading this initiative into talking about integral ecology. What does the Catholic Church have to say? What does Scripture have to say about how we do agriculture? And so, and then with that, there was a program that kind of started where the St. Paul Seminary now has a course for seminarians. In order to graduate, they have to go through this week-long rural practicum course. And so they get taken out to a retreat center and they go and visit farms. And so they are able to get that exposure. When developing some of these programs that we have, I think one of our studies showed that about 50% of parish priests in rural areas have never had exposure to rural. They didn't grow up in rural. Their seminaries were in cities. Their teaching parishes were in cities. And then they ended up in a rural parish and had, like you said, had no idea what a corn plant looks like, no idea what they do.
Very overwhelming.
Exactly.
The culture of the people's different too, not just the plants and animals.
Exactly. So I think the idea there was to move the headquarters into a place where we can do some more of that deeper thinking, have that partnership with the seminary, have that partnership with the St. Thomas campus there as well, and kind of push forward a more theological approach to this as well.
Yeah. What else are you doing with the clergy then, besides these training events that you're kind of helping put on?
Yeah, so in 2019, we received a grant that we're still going through right now, the process of, and it's called the Thriving in Rural Ministry program. And this helps to support the priests to kind of learn rural situations, to learn more about rural, learn more about their communities, the tactics that they have to use. As I mentioned, a lot of priests, are raised in the city. They go to seminary. I think all major seminaries in the United States are in cities, and then eventually they find themselves in rural, and they're looking around and say, like, I don't feel like I have anything in common with these people. I don't know how to speak to them. I don't know how to understand their life. And so we started this program to, invite them on a 5-day retreat to go over a lot of these topics, whether it's rural evangelization, whether it's, how to deal with isolation, how to deal with burnout, how to manage your parish cluster. In the United States here, a rural priest averages 3 to 4 parishes, where it's different than the city and suburban areas where, you can generally have one, and you generally have 2 priests for one parish. And so there's a lot of, or more. And there's a lot of challenges that come along with that is never addressed in seminaries, that's never addressed in the teaching parishes. And so we really wanted to help them navigate the locations that they're in. And we're trying to push that even further now with being more available with online, more of courses, content, forming an actual relationship with them, but then going a step further and having them try to form relationships with each other, as well, that fraternity aspect.
Oh, yes.
As we kind of just touched on, you have multiple priests to a parish, they kind of have a brotherhood going, some fraternity going on. They're able to, talk about different struggles that they're going through. You don't have that in rural communities. And so they need to be able to find people to connect with that can understand their problems and give them reasonable solutions.
Yeah. Yeah. And you got a big city where there might be multiple priests at a certain parish, but for sure there's multiple parishes even. I'm just thinking about my in-laws in Chicago. I mean, there always used to be a church on every corner, basically. Mm-hmm. And out here, where I'm at, and if you go in Minnesota where it's more rural too, you can go quite a ways. You might drive 20, even 30 miles before you get to the next small town parish that ultimately you have priests having to drive back and forth and carry a huge burdensome load. And he's by himself, he's living. And who is he reaching out to? He makes friendships with the laity, of course, but it's not the same. You have to have that fellowship, that fraternity. And it's really good that you guys are seeking to address that. What have you seen a lot of feedback on the digital side? I'm just thinking in our area, at least in the Sioux City Diocese, it's a lot of older priests. So we have a priest shortage for sure, but and I know that's an issue we've talked about too before, Zach, but the aging priests, it's a real issue. And what are you doing where you're trying to add these multiple resources, but some of them maybe aren't tech savvy?
Yeah, so we definitely have that problem. And it's actually quite interesting how each diocese goes about some of these things. Like you kind of mentioned there in the Sioux City Diocese, you kind of have it seems like more older priests in those rural parishes. We've seen some dioceses where a lot of the international priests are the ones to go out into rural parishes, and they have a pretty high percentage of the international priests in those areas. So, with each
We've had
diocese
that too.
comes, with, different problems. But that's why we have the 5-day retreat. That's kind of why they lean towards the 5-day retreat, to be able to get there. The problem that arose was, as I mentioned, managing 3 to 4 parishes. That's a lot of parishes. There's a lot of duties. Generally speaking, that's 3 to 4 parish councils. They're not really merged together. And so we talk about strategies, to try to get parish councils merged together and try to make a more cohesive community. But we can do the best that we can in trying to get them. I know a lot of priests will ask they don't really like online live events because, again, that time. And so that's one of the big complaints is they don't have time for the 5-day retreats either. So, you invite them to a 5-day retreat. They want to be in person. They're about to be, but then all of a sudden they get an emergency call and they have to go do an anointing of the sick. They have to be there for a funeral because there's no other priest in the area that can, take care of those things for them. And so we have to do something, and they might not be tech savvy, but we can try to do the best that we can. And it's one of my goals, as the communications manager, is to just make all the resources of Catholic rural life as accessible as possible. Put it in print, put it in emails, email lists, put it in social media, put it everywhere where people might happen to be. But then also kind of, you mentioned those in-person events, putting, boots on the ground and try to visit these places, I think is a goal of all of ours, who are working at Catholic rural life, is to put ourselves in the community so we can better understand what everyone's going through. And that's always been super helpful.
Oh, absolutely. But one thing you were saying there is you got to have it out there. You got to have the communication where people even know about you. Mm-hmm. I'll be completely honest. And I'm guessing the clergy, at least around here, are probably the same too. Probably a lot of them have never heard of Catholic rural life. So I honestly, and you know this, but for the listener, I initially heard about Catholic rural life because we had Soil and Soul, which is one of our seasonal podcast project, which is a little plug here. It's about to start up again in September 15th. So that'll be right in time for harvest season. It was pretty popular this past spring. Catholic Farmer and myself, we were kind of the co-hosts. We have another gal joining us for this fall here. So we're looking forward to that. But anyway, we had posted it on our Facebook page. And there was someone that commented with all exclamation points. So it drew my attention. It was like, oh my gosh, I love this. This is perfect for me to listen to. I think it was a farmer's wife, if I remember right. But she had said, make sure that you check out Catholic Rural Life. It would be great to collaborate with them. Seems like maybe something that you guys can connect on. I looked you guys up. I reached out, got a hold of you, and then the rest is history. But to the point is like, I would have never heard about CRL if I hadn't gotten that little tidbit. Mm-hmm. So how do we change that? Besides the obvious is just trying to get boots on the ground or sending advertisements, but a lot of stuff costs money too. And that's probably part of you guys' budgeting. But if everybody, well, I guess what my question would be is, you guys are approved by all these different dioceses, but are they intentionally spreading the word for CRL or not necessarily? I mean, I've never seen anything in a Sioux City Diocese Lumen, which is a publication about CRL before, to my knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, bishops have a lot on their plate, and they have a lot of missions, and they have a lot of goals, and they have a lot of people that they have to serve and make sure their needs are met. And so when you talk about a niche, much like rural life, that is in, most dioceses in the United States, when you get these papers, they're looking at the distribution and they're seeing, everything that goes out. Okay, we're putting out 100,000 of these papers within city limits and 10,000 of them outside of it. That's going to curtail to that. And also, I mean, the Catholic faith is universal. So you can just talk about all of the basics and it matters to everyone, instead of talking about these, little stories. But there's definitely been some participation outside of that, especially when we're very attentive. One of the things that I do when we get a story from, I'm trying to think of an example, the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee. So we heard a story
Florida.
from down there, in Florida. And we heard a story down there. They got hit by the hurricane. So we had an issue about the weather, how we are at God's whim. And, everything in farming has to do, you need to pray for rain, you need to pray for maybe a little less rain. You're at this whim of creation. So when we covering, hurricanes, we want to talk about kind of the weather. We want to talk about the hurricane that kind of went through there. And we got a story lead from this community that came together because the winds pushed over the steeple and the foundation was all ruined and everything of that nature.
Oh, wow.
And so, we reached out, he wrote a story. And when we do a story in the magazine like that, we reach out, to that bishop and say, hey, this was something that's going on in your diocese. And your people, thank you for letting us, talk to your people. You obviously have been providing great spiritual guidance. Here's this article that we wrote. Hope you enjoy it. And in that specific example, he turned around and he bought, I think, 100 magazines for that parish for that community to pass out and everything. And now that bishop knows about us. He knows that we care about his people as well. I think that's probably going to be the theme of this whole, our conversation is just caring about these communities and understanding what these communities are going through. And so that's happened multiple times where we're writing stories. Same one in Arlington, not Arlington, Texas. One of the dioceses in Texas, Fort Worth, I believe. They had a community garden at one of their parishes and we wrote about it. This was an issue that was talking about people who are caring for creations within city limits, finding, community garden spots, that their city has for them. And we wrote one there, sent it to their bishop, and, same thing. We got a nice heartfelt response, thanking us for noticing their community's work. And those ones end up in their papers sometimes it's just on their website. But I think, making these relationships and showing them, that we understand and we can speak to each other regarding creation and how we value just being grounded.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. People can really relate to that and they can find so much value in just feeling seen. That's the kind of a cliche way to put it, but really, that's right. I mean, how often it is that we out here in this rural communities and in our today's culture, we don't feel seen because we're the minority. A lot of people don't understand it, how we live, don't understand us in our own personhood. And so you guys are kind of trying to bridge that gap a little bit, on the communication front. And also as an outreach too. I mean, we've been talking about how you guys are directly helping the clergy members, but when it comes to the laity, if I was a member and I was paying, what would be something that I could look to see as major benefits from a CRL membership besides, say, a quarterly newsletter where I'm getting the updates? But like if I was nearby where I could go to an in-person event of some sort or some of these other outreach things that aren't specific to the clergy.
Yeah. So again, you can get involved with your diocesan chapter, or you can even start one if you don't have one. And you do that just by reaching out to us and, starting that conversation, and we can kind of guide you through getting that bishop approval in your area. But we also started recently a new program specifically for laity. It does go through parishes because I think something that we found very important is parish health at the moment. In order to have a thriving Catholic community, you need to have a thriving parish. And so talk to your priest, and this is still in the pilot phase. So eventually the structure will be talk to your priest and you can get involved in the program that we call Thriving Rural Congregations. And that is you get your priest on board and then he's going to kind of select a leadership team. I kind of mentioned a couple of minutes ago about how one of the most common things that we hear from priests being able to attend TRM or thriving in rural ministry retreats is that they don't have time, they don't have support. And so our solution was, well, how about we help you develop a lay leadership team to start building up your local community? Because everything has to be local. I mean, I've already mentioned it,
Yep.
we see corn, we see soybeans, we see this, I can't truly, just as a human being, I can't truly understand the woes and the joys that you go through if you're a rancher, for example, because it's not the life, that I live. And the land makes us, who we are, especially if you're in agriculture. And
Yeah.
so being able to support you as, laity to start building up your own communities and supporting, giving you support in that. And this also helps us realize, some of what those problems are. The two ones that stick out to me is once this program started, we realized, okay, we need to have more resources for suicide prevention, isolation, addiction, those types of things. So our program manager for the Thriving Rural Congregations got certified to be kind of a person who can teach other, counselors, and she got that training herself, so she can kind of guide people
Great.
in form that for their community. But then also the other one was intercultural competencies.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
So it's not just in the South. I mean, obviously, there's a rising population, of, let's say, Hispanics, and it's all over the country, too. I mean, there's a lot in Kansas that we see. We see it up in
Sure.
North Dakota. So it's not just the South. And so we have these different types of cultures, people who are raised differently, who are formed, differently, can't maybe even speak the same language, but we want to be able to support them, and we want to be able to get that community to be able to support each other. Much too often we'll see that, okay, these communities are actually dividing, not out of any other reason besides, okay, here's, the English mass and here's the Spanish mass. And so you have a parish that's almost got two different things going on, and those people have never met, they never interact with each other. And so being able to walk parishes through, okay, how do we bring your congregation together? How do we be one body of, Christ, the people of Christ together? And so that's kind of what I mean by, the intercultural competencies.
Yeah. There's so much to share and also grasp from one another in that way. We don't have to segregate. And again, like you said, a lot of it just unintentional because you go into a separate mass.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a strong need for that. You said Hispanic for the one example, but a lot of these people coming in are some of the most vibrant Catholics, per capita in their faith anyway, again, comparing to the people that have lived around here. Unfortunately, the culture has changed over time. Now, again, when we're talking about the Midwest, as a rule, we tend to be more faith-filled than, say, I don't know, your coasts or in a big city, again, per capita. But there's just completely different needs. I don't know, this is one speculation just off the cuff here. One, we could talk about why that is. And I would kind of venture to say that at least if you are somewhat involved with agriculture, or if you just live out in the country and you just live on an acreage, but you have a town job, you have different set of problems and issues that you go through that someone in the city might never see. I mean, for one thing, you have to always travel to go get anything. You might go through a lot harsher winters. You get snowed in, and then you're blocked in. And then obviously we go back in time and it used to be a lot harder, but our work, especially as farmers, ranchers in the agriculture field, we aren't being seen by it in that way. And I feel like when you go through a time period where 1 year is great for you financially and prosperous in both crop and also providing for your family, but then the next is all taken away by simply a weather event, and you have no control over it whatsoever. Well, this happened many, many generations ago, but it's even biblical. People became very spiritual. They were driven to seek a higher power, to trust, to trust in something more. That when you have no power, you turn over that power and say, I'm going to give this up. I'm going to surrender. And I mean, in my office here, you can't see it's in front of me, but up on my wall, I just have a handwritten thing that says to-do list, for today. Number 1, surrender. Number 2, it's just a blank after that, because that's all that, you start there and it all kind of fills in.
Yeah, I was just talking to a homesteader in southern Indiana, and he made a really interesting observation talking about kind of what you just mentioned. Is he noticed anyone who works the land, whether they're homesteading, farming, they are all spiritual in nature. Maybe not Christian, maybe not Catholic, but there's something spiritual about it because they know that they're at the whim of something. Like they do not have total control of their vocation that they're called to. And so I just thought that was a really interesting point where it's like, yeah, I can see that. And I think Catholic farmers, some of them can learn from that, It's not everything that you can do is in your power, to get the best harvest for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, we have to remind ourselves that over and over, and maybe even more so nowadays because we have this information age and you have social media, and you don't just get the quarterly successful farming magazine. You also get Facebook posts or stuff so instant messaging where you hear about somebody across the country. Heck, just even the next state over, I hear about guys in Illinois having the best yields of their life, and I'm getting like a lot poorer. So it's not just the comparison to the guy across the road where I feel like I gotta, gotta be the better crop producer, or he's got better looking cattle than me. So there's that competition going on. It's also across a larger swath. And in the end, we got to realize we all are just got to give it up to God. Mm-hmm. And it's not what's important anyway. We got to separate the business. And this is just speaking as a farmer myself. We really need to learn, in a rancher, it's the same thing, farming and ranching. You got to separate the business from the lifestyle. I think that's a really important differentiation and I've gotten to be over the last year or two where now I tell people, especially when they're from the city or in Chicago, and I'm talking to them like, yeah, I'm a farmer. First, I'm a man of God, and I'm a husband and a father, and then I'm a farmer by lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And then after that, I'm a farmer by profession, and hopefully it pays the bills too. But I'm a farmer because I enjoy it. Even if it's kind of like teachers. I mean, they don't get paid enough, right? And usually they're pretty passionate about their job. The cliche is always saying that teachers don't do it for the money. Well, most farmers don't do it for the money, except, I don't know, in the times that are really good, it seems like we get a whole plethora of getting wound up in that and the next big thing and the biggest flashiest equipment, or the just focusing on, I'm going to do, early before we started recording, we started talking about being workaholics, right?
Yeah.
How often are us farmers just so focused on the work itself that it becomes an idol?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the beauties, kind of that I've seen with the homesteading movement, and specifically you mentioned technology, of people who have full-time jobs, but then they have, 50 acres of land that they're also working. And you mentioned like that's not their job. They do that for fun. They do that for joy. They do that to be grounded to the earth and closer to God. And I find that interesting, some of the opportunities that people seized on to, I can be fully remote. So I'm going to, wake up at 6 a.m., start, working as an accountant, end my work day at 4 p.m., if my math adds up right. And then at 4 p.m., I'm going to go take the kids outside and we're going to go collect the eggs. We're going to go milk the cow. We're going to go do this. And obviously it's at a much smaller scale than those who farm for business, but there's
the lifestyle.
They're looking at farmers and seeing like, wow, what a courageous way to live. And they're trying to seize a piece of that for themselves out of just pure joy, and they're not worried about the money. I think there's something very interesting to be said about that.
Yes. I love the whole homesteading and just rural acreage life, the aspect of that. And it's sad that a lot of acreages have actually gotten bulldozed and turned into just prime farmland and cropping over, because there aren't near as many acreages out there, at least in my part of Iowa, that there used to be, just because it's flat, really good, valuable dirt. We have less of a population than we used to. But like when my dad was my age or younger, I mean, there was someone on every corner and then some. It was every half mile or quarter mile even. There was someone, a lot. And now it's definitely more sparse. And different parts have not maybe gone down as much, but I know there's probably other parts of the country that are even more remote now than they used to be in a comparison. And it's too bad, because like you were just attesting to, people are seeing that value. They're like, okay, maybe I'm called to do this professionally. But again, when that differentiation, I want to have the rural lifestyle. I want to have that agricultural or farming lifestyle, even if I'm not actively out there with a whole bunch of equipment or raising a whole 2,000 head of cattle or hogs. I might have a couple head, and I'm doing that as a family. That's the biggest thing about the lifestyle that farming has to offer. It's so much more familial based than really any other lifestyle, especially when it ties to a profession.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember growing up, like our whole meal table conversations were always as a family. It was all about what was happening on the farm. And we didn't feel like there was that distance as a young kid hearing from my dad or even my mom talking about what she was doing, because guess what? We had something to do with it. Even after school, like we were out there in the hog building running around. A lot of times we were riding in the cart with the pigs, and we knew all the things that were going on, and we were connected to that. And whether it was the summer and we were more active in it, or it was on the weekends or even the evenings too during the school year, either way, we have an active part with it. And it's the same thing for someone just living on an acreage with just a couple head of chickens and a little extra big garden. And it's fun because they get their hands into it, and it's a family affair.
Yeah, and I think that brings up one of the other problems that we're seeing in rural now is kind of the inability to convince the younger generations to kind of take up the torch and run these family farms. You mentioned there was, always a house on every street corner or a different family in each street corner. Now it's becoming less and less. But we were luckily seeing, and I think kids really spark is when, some, Catholic families or even non-Catholic families have kids, they want that agricultural background. So I think there's a big question to be had, and something we need to figure out, as just a Catholic community is how do we translate like this is an honorable job, like it's not all just, like you said about the money, we're acting in accordance with natural law, with lower creation, the way, Christ intended it to be. And then we can hopefully see that slowing down of, family farms disappearing. I was looking up, prior to this, in like, I think it was like 1960, there was 4.2 million farms, and now we're down to 2.2 million farms, over, what is that, a 60-year span, 65-year span. And so I think that's a big problem. And I'm guilty of this too. I was born and raised in rural part of Wisconsin, and ever since, I can remember, I was like, okay, well, I got to go to college, so I'm going to leave here, and then I'm going to go where I ended up in the Twin Cities because of job security, for example. That was a big worry of mine when I was in high school. It's like, okay, well, if I want to pay for a college education, I need to have a job. And, luckily, I'm also a convert, so it's kind of fitting, so I converted to the Catholic faith, and then just a couple of years later, I found Catholic rural life and kind of realized, wow, I was really wrong. As I felt myself drawing closer to Christ, I was like, well, I need to get closer to the land too now. And so I landed in Catholic rural life, and I had this realization. He was like, oh, wow, I'm very appreciative of the upbringing that I had. I had horses, I had beef cows, I had a pond where ducks would always come. We did maple syrup with the family. There's a bunch of things going on. And I spent my very young years, in my formative years, some would call it, running away from that, being like, oh no, this society says this is bad, like I need to get away from this. And then I end up here where I am, Catholic convert, trying to read everything I can get my hands on, joining Catholic rural life. I'm like, wow, that is the life. And how do we translate that to, other younger generations is a big question mark that I think a lot of people have. And hopefully we can kind of figure it out.
Yeah, that's right. I returned home to the farm after I had a 4-year degree at Iowa State. And when I went off to college, I was basically intending to not come back to the farm anytime soon, if at all. I didn't really know what I wanted to do for sure. I just knew that at least at first I wanted to get far away because I'd been working on the farm. I'd been putting a lot of hours in. I felt like, I'd been robbed of a childhood or something. And ultimately, I went through college and did a couple internships. But by the time I got a little bit more mature, as men, we know that we take a little longer to mature. So maybe I was somewhat mature by the time I graduated college, and I was able to really get a little bit more introspective and realize that, no, I wasn't robbed of a childhood. I was given the best childhood. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to come back to that childhood or that place that made it happen. And that's where I am today, back on the family farm. I'm literally in the house where I was raised, actually. It's an old Mennonite house, so it's multi-generational at this point. It's been added on and rent out and all that stuff too. But it's cool how, and that's another thing too, when I talk to, say, in-laws or other people from in big cities, they talk about, yeah, we've been in this house, since whatever year. It's kind of a big deal. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess my family's been for multi-generations on this place. And they just mind boggles them, because it's a totally different thing to think that you'd be rooted as a family for more than just even 10 years is a long time sometimes, because people are moving around and they aren't as rooted in their home. I mean, yeah, they decorate it and they look at Pinterest and they make a home. They make a house a home. That's a cliche thing, right? But it's so much more when you live out in the country, in the rural life. You have that tied to like a legacy a lot of times, especially if it's agricultural related and you have a farm around you. But even in acreage, I know a lot of people that have multi-generational acreages and they never farm themselves at all. They just want to have that experience out in the country. And of course, they hope that their kids do too, so that can keep going. Of course, hopefully they're supportive of whatever their child decides to do ultimately. But I know there's always that hope probably because they know that's best. And maybe I'm biased. I shouldn't say best. That's the wrong thing to say. But what their experience has led for their positives, I should say.
Yeah, most definitely. And you kind of mentioned talking to people who live in cities. I've met a ton of them who live in cities now, and they remember being raised on a farm, as the good old days.
Yeah.
Not so much so that they're willing to move back. They see a lot of the downs, and a lot of the stress that were upon their parents. I don't want that, but they look back with a very fond memory of those things. And I think that's just, beautiful, at least with that recognition. And so a lot of our members are actually from, within urban and suburban settings who were raised on farms, and they knew that they know at least now that it was super important and super honorable and beautiful. But, they also saw the stress and everything that were put upon, their parents, if their parents were running it in, those bad years and things like that. And they're like, okay, well, I'm glad I'm safe here, but gosh, like that's amazing out there.
Yeah. Well, speaking of safe, I mean, I think we have seen a slight uptick since 2020 when there was the COVID thing and people being scared about being in a claustrophobic, extra tight, high population area. You started seeing people move away out to acreages and out to smaller towns. And I think that has continued. I have to go back and look at the statistics. I'm not going to try to quote a number and be wrong, but I believe there was a larger chart where we were going down for quite a while as far as number of people out in the country. And I think that's gone back up somewhat in the last 5 years. People are coming back and they're looking for acreages. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, a lot of them are gone, and it's made them pretty valuable, at least in our Iowa area where people are seeking them out. People want that lifestyle. And to your point about your members that live in cities, I wonder what the age is on a lot of them, because I know there's a lot of people that they'd be older than me and you, or older than you and I should say. And they would be, I got to correct my grammar here. They would have parents that would have gone through the 80s farm crisis, right? Or if you talk about their grandparents, they would have, again, talking, depending on the age here, they might have gone through like the Great Depression, or just even a generational time where agriculture was much harder to work with. If you're farming or ranching, I mean, you were doing much more physical labor. The equipment and technology hadn't been developed as much. It was just really a hard life with little to gain in financials and prosperity and the luxurious items that may have not developed. And you go to the city and it would look a lot different. I mean, they might not have had running water or electricity if you go far enough back, but the city did. That didn't get developed as quickly, right? And it came to the small towns and out to the country much later comparatively. So they might have, kind of a memory that way, or they might have been raised not with that, but they hear their parents talking about it. And so an interesting thing that I have heard about a number of times is where they were kind of interested in staying on the farm, but if their dad lived through, like, for instance, the more recent one would be the 80s, like the farm crisis, they were told, no, I want you to go to 4-year college and I fully expect you to get a town job. And I want you to live in a town and I want you to have a life that's better than what I've had, which is sad because it's like a little bit of blinders, because it's all timing. But if the dad or the family had just gone through some really hard times and they got their son or daughter, they're like, I love you and I don't want you to just experience these really bad years that I just had. And I don't think farming is going to ever be the same. Well, I mean, they were wrong. So it's all cyclical. But I just wonder if I'm hoping that maybe we are in a cycle now where things have been, and we can always complain about the price of corn being too low right now, but it's not the farm crisis of the 80s, and cattle prices are good. If you can look at the cycle that we're in right now, hopefully we have fathers, and I'm a father now, but it's a young children. Hopefully you have parents that are telling their kids, look what we are doing out here as a family. Look at this experience we are taking part in with God's goodness around us, within nature, and in our own little world out here. And I want that for you in the future. And hopefully you will choose to experience it. And if not, I support you, but I would love to support you if you would like to continue this legacy, versus like strongly encouraging them to leave the farm.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of mentioned a lot of different things there. And that's one thing that I'll never pretend that I know, is to understand the business side of farming. Like, you're talking about price per acreage, the corn pricing, cattle pricing. I was watching one of the popular publications was trying to, look under the hood of, like what a farmer goes through. And he's, talking about how, farmers have to borrow money at the beginning of the year, for seed, for, this and that. And so like when they make money, well, they're not actually making money. They're just, raising money to pay back what they owe. And then,
rolling it over to the next loan.
Exactly. And at that point, I remember watching that video and I was like, okay, like I'm going to have to go visit some people. And even then, I probably will never fully understand, especially the weight behind all of these different things. Because I think it is, stressful. And it's one of those, you mentioned, beautiful things where farming takes a very courageous person to start it, but then almost has to be generational to kind of show the ropes of how you get these things done in a smart, practical, and holy manner. And this, I think, that goes along with almost all activities for that involve creation, involve rural. The one example, that I always thought was interesting was like hunting. You know how hard it is to just never hunted in your life and then try to, you're in your 20s and you're like, okay, I'm going to go hunting. It's really hard to do. It's really hard to figure out. You don't know how to navigate public lands. You don't know how to skin a deer. You never did it. You almost have to be taught by somebody who has done it. You almost need kind of like a mentorship, like some of the more blue collar jobs operate, in order to even begin to understand, one, how the business works, but two, how to deal with the stress and how to make those decisions as well. Yeah.
And I like your hunting analogy, because if you were raised doing that with your dad or your mom as a young kid, it's just like learning the piano or any instrument. I mean, we're more impressionable when we're younger, but it's also just back to that thing I was saying about that familial activity or that familial lifestyle together. You're doing that together. So farming is that same way. You're literally riding along, checking fields, or you got your hand in the dirt, helping fix something or look at the crop or the seed with your dad, with your mom. You're doing these things together. You're going hunting together. It's a lot different than as an adult deciding to then learn, and ultimately you can get a mentor, but it's not the same. It's not quite as easy, and the experience is different too. It's more like you just are like, might be interested in learning underwater basket weaving, so I might go and find a mentor for that, and then it'll be a hobby of mine. But it's not the same as if I'd been doing that all along with my parents and my siblings when I was younger.
And this goes back to what does Catholic rural life, try to do and to support laity? And you're kind of, hitting something there, is well, we can only say and teach so much, without that family aspect. It's going to be very hard. And we saw this with the beginning of the homesteading movement. This was many years ago, where you had a lot of Catholics moving and buying homesteads. And I remember this one very popular story that came out was someone tried to go on homestead and they just went bankrupt. And they just went, and it was like the Catholic homesteading movement is a bunch of liars. They're lying to me. And I think it was being overglorified, probably, right? But it is a very honorable vocation to attempt to do. But without being very conscientious of what you're doing, it's really hard to start those things up. And I don't think that should deter anyone. But, I think what you mentioned before was there's going to be at this certain point where like this isn't all about money. You have to make those decisions. You have to have the income to support yourself and to support your family. But this is a vocation. This is something that you do for joy. This is something you do to be closer to God, and His creation. And maybe eventually you can form that into a way that can be profitable, for you. I don't know how profitable like family farms are. You know much more about that. Like I said, I don't know too much about the business end of farming, but some people I think go about it the wrong way. They see all the glory and they don't see the highs and the lows, and they get caught in the lows. But having family support is the one thing that can get you through that. So when you have an organization like Catholic Real Life, trying to promote some of these things, I think like parish, structure, community-based, stuff, and then family structure, is going to be very important in the promotion of some of these activities. I was down in the Diocese of La Crosse, I believe, last year, and there was a fresh homesteader bought, I think they mentioned like 30 acres of land right in the heart of all of these dairy farms. And this, larger scale dairy farm was angry because he wanted the 30 acres for his establishment.
Of course.
And he had this resentment towards them. But then, their cow got sick and they had one cow. And I remember him telling the story. He's like, I went over there and like one cow, like, how are you going to make money with one cow? Like, what are you guys are so, you guys just aren't thinking. And they're like, well, one cow makes, like X amount of, this cow makes X amount of gallons per week, like that feeds the family, yeah. And so this resentment turned, he's like, okay, these people don't know what they're doing, but they have a very interesting way at viewing the world. And so he helped them and they kind of formed this community, and he kind of became, the, quote unquote mentor to this family and was able to help them out, and they were able to succeed. And he had a much different way of viewing his own dairy farm. And he thought it was a great experience overall, even though he came at it a little bit, heated, but being able to have these communities support each other. And this is one of the important things of why Catholic Real Life thinks that we need to have those more in-person events too, is so these people can have those connections in their community.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that you said probably about 10 minutes ago when you were talking about having the holy aspect of farming or the rural life, whether it's homesteading or you're a large-scale family farm, is I just think, and you mentioned that you don't understand necessarily the economics or the financials as much on the business side of it, but one thing that I'll just say here is, as a farmer, you are like the one profession, this is always the cliche thing said, you're like the one profession where you can work all year long. You're probably in debt the whole year. You don't get paid until the end of the year when you sell your crop or you sell your cattle or you sell your hogs, et cetera. And it might be different with livestock if you're selling throughout the year, but your crop is until the end. You got this all in debt. And then ultimately when you get the money coming in, you're ultimately just going to roll it over to the next loan. And you might not even have enough anyway, because you didn't get to choose what the price of the product was. So you have the one industry, the one profession where you can have your input costs go up and down, and you do not get a say in how you can change your price of your output. So if Walmart, for instance, or JCPenney's a retailer, if their price of their input cost coming in changes, well, they just raise their prices for the consumer. If our input costs, our interest, our equipment, the price of fertilizer, the price of seed, et cetera, goes up, feed for the cattle goes up, we don't get to change the price of the output. It's all based on Chicago Board of Trade. The traders, really, speculators, a lot of them don't really have anything to do with farming. A lot of them that move the market, they're sitting in some big city, maybe even Chicago, and moving the market. And we're kind of at the whim of people. Sometimes it gets to be sort of like a speculative thing, and they really drive it way up, but they also drive it way down too. So it's kind of crazy. So just a short little tangent on that, where there is a lot of stress to be had. And that's why a lot of farmers will take out insurance to try to protect themselves, say through crop insurance, et cetera. But you can get so wrapped up in the stresses of the business that you forget that the joys that override that, and that's where the holiness comes in. So not only are we a unique profession that way, and again, I'm differentiating between the lifestyle and the business, of course, but the professional side is not only do we have that where it's unique that way, but we're also unique that we get to have such a spiritual side to our profession. I think it's quite unique. It's probably not the only one out there, but it's pretty unique that you get to work with your hands and plant something, plant new creation and watch it grow. And that can be a prayer in of itself. You know, every job that you do day to day, you give it up to God. You can do that. But it's just a special, unique situation that we have as farmers and ranchers where our life and death, our creation and harvest for hopefully the good of others too. We're feeding the world is hopefully how we look at it. It's a greater good and it's a prayer in of itself and lift it up to God. And we trust, we have to trust in him a lot. We have to surrender and we can hopefully live our life as a whole from that message, right? I need to surrender how I live the rest of my life with my family, with my friends and loved ones, the other things that I do outside of the farm, hopefully in that same surrender fashion.
Yeah, I think you kind of, just quickly mentioned there, with your family. I mean, farming is one of those, we keep talking about family and I think it's very important, but like farming is one of those vocations where every day can be bring your child to work day. It's not how it works, in a lot of the corporate world. You can't be an accountant, you can't be a manager and, just bring your kids with you into the cab of your tractor to go and work the fields and go milk the cows or whatever discipline it is that you do. And so it allows for the raising of a family in such a strong way. The other comment that, kind of made is you talking about like pricing of corn. I know something that's been super interesting. So I grew up all the way on the eastern side of Wisconsin and now live in Twin Cities. So I have to drive across the whole of Wisconsin just to get back home to visit my parents. And something I've seen more frequently as I'm driving through, rural areas is people selling product just straight from their farm too. They probably have their buyers, if that's what the term is for the overall crop, but they're selling a lot of, whether it's artisan goods as well as just, some stuff on the side, just straight, call me, fresh sweet corn or, call me, buy some beef cow or what have you. I've noticed that has been on the increase. And I've also saw a variety of livestock increase as well. Usually before it was a lot of all cow. I've seen an increase of sheep, people buying and raising sheep now through central Wisconsin at the moment.
And I think that's that direct to consumer is what they call that. Mm-hmm. And that has had a huge uptick since COVID, like the 2020 timeframe, because along with that whole demographic shift of people wanting to get away from the city, some people wanting to get away from the city and have a more of a sheltered or more remote lifestyle, seeing the value of like homesteading or living out in a small town rural. There's also a large group of people that even if you live in a big city, you see the value and you want to know where your food comes from. Mm. And just more of a health awareness, right? And more of I want to know what is going into my body. Yep. Right. And I want to know where it came from. I want to know the story behind it to some degree. And so there's been kind of a shift where people will pay more and will seek out to do the buy direct to consumer.
Yep. CSAs.
So they want to. Yeah.
I've seen CSAs become more popular. Before I started at Catholic Rural Life, I was working more in the corporate world. I mean, they would yearly, try to get people to sign up for the CSA. You're buying fresh produce from local farms that are just driving it in and dropping it off at our place of work. And so I think that's also increasing as well.
Yeah. And I think it's been great for the small time farmer and the family that is just doing a little acreage and they got a big garden, or they only have a few chickens, or they have a few pigs. That's been great because it might have been harder for them to, if they weren't just only providing for themselves and they were doing a little bit more, but they aren't to the scale that they're this huge farmer. You could call it factory farming, whatever you want to call it, but this large scale family farming. If they aren't to that level and they're somewhere in between, especially on the smaller side, what's their outreach? It was harder before. And now I think it's gotten quite a bit easier to move the product or have those connections with people because now the consumers are actually actively seeking it out. And I think there's a lot of value in that. Going back to Catholic Rural Life, I just see how this can kind of tie around. Again, we were talking about family, we're talking about community. I really get the strong sense that at a heart of CRL is bringing people together. And it's not just the clergy and it's not just the laity. It's all together. There's something for everybody. And you guys are definitely bridging the gap to fill in these blanks and having people feel that they are truly seen, whether they live out in the middle of nowhere in Utah or they have farmers all around them, but bringing people together so that we can share in this lifestyle and, of course, on a spiritual level too, as Catholics.
Yeah, make sure they're seen and also supported. I'll push a little further, a lot of the comments that we get too is, we want to support all those that are in rural, and that goes from homesteaders all the way up to agro business. Generally sometimes you have some discourse, between the two, homesteaders not liking, agro business and agro business not liking homesteaders, kind of like a story with that in. I try my hardest to understand all the frustrations. But like I said before, the Catholic faith is universal and we all have vocations. We're called to do different things and we're feeding the world. I look at the number and see, okay, we lost 2 million farms, in 65 years. So if we're looking at it from, we need to feed the world, well, someone has to work that land. Maybe we want it to be done in the most ethical way, using seldom pesticides or using ethical pesticides and things like that to be able to increase yield, really keeping in mind the dignity of worker. Don't take advantage of your workers. We're talking to the agro business side of thing, but also recognizing supporting agro business in that way is like, treat your workers. Here's a good guidance, and I've talked to farmers who have thousands of acres of land and I would classify them as agro business, and they really 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 do care. And they really take their Catholic faith seriously, and they're trying, their hardest. But then I also, at Catholic Real Life, we also look at, the homesteaders and see what they're doing and see that the lens that they see the world is extraordinarily beautiful. And we want to support everyone. And even like you said, if you drive into work, you're still driving 20 minutes. You're still passing by all this woods or plains or desert, depending on where you live. And it's beautiful. God designed everything that we can see, when it comes to creation. And so we want to support all those people and figure out, how can we bring back this rural lifestyle and bring back a way of life that is grounded, that is conscientious of where their food comes if they're in urban, to, participate in creation if they're in suburban areas, and, try to plant a garden, try to see how much effort and water it takes for a tomato to grow. So you can understand what that process looks like. And so we really pride ourselves at Catholic Real Life to understand and have the discussions and listen to anyone who's working the land, who wants to work the land, who used to work the land, who's living, in rural, which the United States Census, classifies any town under 50,000. So there's a lot of people out there who are like, I don't live in rural, I live in this big city. And it's like, well, I think the reason why, if I remember the reasoning, is a town that's below 50,000 people generally operates or has very recently operated basically on a farm economy. And so they see a lot of the same problems that other people, in smaller towns also see. And so, we just are trying to have this conversation with all these people and try to understand and to bring awareness to the way of life that people in rural are living.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Even if someone wants to insist, they're like, no, I'm definitely a city slicker, if they want to call themselves that. I'm definitely a city dweller, even though it's 50,000 or less. Let's say they live in a town of 40,000 and they insist that they are definitely not living out in the country. Well, yeah, but with that size of a town, you most likely know people that do live in the country, and they're not that far away. It's different than when you live in, well, I'll say St. Paul, for instance. You have to travel a little bit further. There are people that live in St. Paul that have never talked to a farmer or have never talked to a homesteader before. It's quite possible, likely actually. But if you live in, a town in a different part of Minnesota, and it's even I don't know, you would know the towns better, but an example of a town that is under that 50,000, but not like way up in the boonies up north there where it's only like 50 people. Well, there's cornfields around and there's cattle around there. And people, even if they are town dwellers, they definitely experience that lifestyle. So their issues coincide and they overlap, and their interests do overlap. And that communal sense. And hopefully we can try to bring that, any sort of distancing, we can bring that closer. We want to bring these people together, especially when it comes to a shared faith, especially.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I would say maybe Duluth. I don't know the population of Duluth, but that was one thing that's interesting too. Is you talk about the North Shore, so we call it in Minnesota, up there by Lake Superior.
Yeah.
It's very similar to like Door County in Wisconsin. Speaking of areas that I know, where you get a lot more artisanship, and that's what rural is. You
Yep.
get people, a lot of retired age people, but then when we talk about parish structure, the parishes and the priests' lives are very similar to those in other actively farming communities. I remember when we were, me and my family were in Door County last year. They had one priest that travels all the way up the thumb of Wisconsin. And so if you missed your mass time on Sunday, in, let's say, Egg Harbor, because that's the one town that I can remember, that's where we stayed. If you missed it,
Okay.
you have to try to travel up and get the mass time. You have to drive up about half hour, 45 minutes to the next parish north, because he starts a Saturday night mass down in the Green Bay area and is traveling upward. And so if you miss your mass time, okay, now you have to try to get to the next mass, which is 2 hours after the last one, and it's about a 30, 45-minute drive. And there's no seconds easy. If you miss that one, you're going to go further north.
That's right. It actually gets kind of a ghost town a little bit in the off season.
Mm-hmm.
I know about Door County. I've been there once before. My wife's family has been going up there annually for quite a few years now, actually, to Egg Harbor, actually, that same area. And it's beautiful. Very, very much an artisan area, like you said, very touristy.
Mm-hmm.
And if you get in the shoulder season, or the off season rather, it kind of gets to be a ghost town, and it's different. And I can imagine it's very much that way. It's very much not rural. I don't think of it as rural, but when it comes to but it is. It's that same aspect when it comes to your faith, of being remote and having that experience with your clergy, and being, I have to travel. I probably have to travel to get to where I need to go, and to have this shared experience with a Catholic faith. And what did you say? How many parishes how remote was it?
I'm trying to think of how many parishes it was, because we were looking at like the tour schedule is kind of how I phrased it to my wife. I believe it was 4 or 5 parishes starting kind of in the Bay. I think Egg Harbor might have been number 2 or 3 on the list, and then it just went further north from there. And then they did have, I think the latest Sunday night one was on, what's that island? Washington Island, I think, is right off. So like the priest has to get on the ferry, travel across, and go
get on a ferry and go up there.
Yep.
Oh my.
And these problems are so unique. This is the one thing that I love about my job, and the work that we do at Catholic Rural Life, is it's so unique. Like, these are very unique problems. Obviously I said North Shore, Minnesota, and Door County, but I could just imagine someone from Montana listening to this and be like, I have to drive 2 hours to my parish every Sunday.
They laugh. They laugh at what we're talking about. They're like, you don't even know remote.
Yes, exactly. And so, I've had a conversation with a lady out of, I think, Wyoming, and she, I think, traveled an hour and a half each way, so to get to mass every Sunday. And she just had when I talked to her, she just had a newborn baby. I think she, has child number 2. As someone who has 2 children, that sounds difficult.
Yes,
so there's,
to say the least,
all these problems that are very unique to all these areas. And so there's just, like I said, that's why I think listening is so important, and being able to support everyone, and really forming those local communities in these areas to be able to support one another. I don't think I'll ever get bored working at Catholic Rural Life, because there's just so much to see and to learn constantly, that it just puts me in awe. It's truly awing, because northern Florida is much different than southern Florida. Texas is much different than Minnesota. The economy, the agricultural economy of Southern California is significantly different than Northern California, and so on and so forth. You can keep drawing these lines everywhere, and it's just fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And Catholic Rural Life, or CRL, definitely has a lot to offer that way. And kind of that's a good segue too, as we wrap up. What if, let's say you're a layperson listening to this, whether you're in Iowa where I'm at, or you're far across the country in a totally different area, maybe a different type of lifestyle, and you're interested in what you're hearing here, how would you, besides just going on you guys' website, how would you go about trying to learn more about what you guys offer? Because we've talked about a lot tonight, and there's in-person stuff, there's a lot of stuff on. I think it could be overwhelming, is what I'm getting at. I think it could overwhelm someone listening. And where do they start?
I would say, Catholic Rural Life is in a unique position of growth right now. And I think we're still at the point where if you want to learn more about CRL or where to start, just send me an email and tell me your story. My email is Zach, Zach at catholicrurallife.org. Let's just have a conversation and see your story, hear your story, and you talk about, what you can do. We're still working on the timeline for when the Thriving Rural Congregations, our laity program will go into the public phase. Right now it's in the pilot, so it only operates in 4 dioceses with select parishes, but at a certain point it will open up and any parish can request to start that program. Or if you're interested in starting a chapter, let me know and I can point you in the right direct. But I am just super interested in hearing everybody's story and sharing it with rural Catholic America at the moment, whether it's on our website, whether it's, in our email lists, whether it's in the magazine, for example. People want to hear the honorable work that everyone is doing. And I think, like I said, I think we're in a position right now where that's still an option where you can reach out to us and you will get a reply email. Hopefully, God willing, we can, keep growing this and it becomes a movement so big where maybe that's less likely. But I think at this current stage, I think that's definitely an option. Always consider, to just become a member, $50 a year to get the quarterly magazine. Gives you more things that you can read while you're resting at night. And maybe you find something interesting and be like, hey, I found this article really interesting, and write me an email about that. So we know that we're going in the right direction as well.
Yeah. And I really like how you're saying you want to hear people's stories. And that's something that with Catholic pastors, we always just keep hitting home, keep reiterating, because I think deep down, my understanding is that people feel like they don't have a story. They might hear someone on the podcast, or I might lead a retreat, an in-person retreat. And I've been told this when I try to get people on board with the next, as a team. And they're like, well, I can't do that. I mean, it's amazing the witness I just heard from you, Aaron, but I don't have anything fancy to tell. I'm just nobody. And I'm like, whoa, that's like the deeper onion layer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you feel like you aren't worthy. You feel like you don't have a story to tell. Well, no, that's wrong. God does see you. He loves you. You are special, and you do have a story to tell. Everyone has something to share.
Yeah. Farmers are extremely humble people. Sometimes I think a little bit overly so. I've talked to my fair share of, older farmers, and everything we talked about today is just very nonchalant. I think they think of it as a burden, and they don't really want to share that. When we take our seminarians to do farm tours, one of them is an older gentleman who does corn and soybean farming, but he's much like that. He's like, how do you do all this? He's like, I just wake up in the morning, get in the tractor, do the work that needs to be done, and then I go to sleep and do that every single day.
Yeah, it's no big deal, right?
Exactly. And I think that's a humble response, but relationships are so important. And so everyone, like you said, has a story. And so to be able to, I think what's really important for farmers is to be able to reflect on the work that you're doing and see the beauty that others see that you're doing at the moment is very important. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I want to throw this in here, and I know we're going long and everything here, but I want to steal this from my local priest's homily from this past Sunday, because it was just so good. He was talking about humus. Do you know what humus is? Like in soil, it's organic matter. Mm-hmm. It's what makes it rich. Like here in Iowa, we have the real pure, black, fertile soil. It's a lot of organic matter, a lot of humus. So humus actually comes from the word humility. I actually didn't know that. So we are all called to be the rich, fertile soil, right? And it's so on par with, well, again, soil and soul coming up here. I'll pitch that again, but also just what our conversation here today, we are called to be the rich soil and to share of ourselves, to share richly and with that fertile humus in humility in this lifestyle and in community. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there too.
Most definitely.
So, well, thanks so much for your time, Zach. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I hope, you've shared your contact information if anybody wants to reach out. Otherwise, catholicrurallife.org is the website.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks so much again, and
have a good night. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Catholic Passage Podcast, and we hope that it blesses you. Please check out our show notes for a reflection takeaway, as well as more info on Catholic Passage. We aim to support parents and educators as they pass on the Catholic faith and way of life to their children and students. To find out more about what we offer, or how you might collaborate with us, visit CatholicPassage.com. Most importantly, you can support us through your prayers. We'll be praying for you. Please pray for us.